Hello, you are listening to Nudge with me, Phil Agnew. Now, everyone listening will know that our environment is under threat. The effects of climate change are already having devastating impacts on the planet. 2020 was the hottest year on record, according to NASA. Pollution warms our planet, spoils our drinking water, destroys our soil, and ultimately harms our health. Despite considerable effort from communities and organisations across the world, a global solution to climate change has been hard to find. Currently, it sort of looks like we're fighting a losing battle, behind on targets and unable to stop temperatures rising. One of the reasons is that most governmental reforms are intended to curb climate change with top-down regulations, like mandated reductions in carbon. What's increasingly obvious, though, is that more is needed. To halt climate change, an individual's behaviour will have to change as well. 2/3 of climate emissions come from within our own homes, which is where nudging comes in. Over the past years, nudging has become a mainstream tool in several environmental sectors, including energy use, waste handling, and resource efficiency. It's an effective method for changing behaviour, but can it really stop climate change? Now, we're not short of examples of where nudges have encouraged climate-friendly behaviour. Studies cited in the Nordic report on nudging for pro-environmental behaviour found that making changes in the default options can increase uptake of green energy supply. And providing real-time information by using, for instance, in-house smart meters to display energy usage can reduce peak consumption. There was a famous 2007 study that gave customers an ambient orb that glowed red when energy use was high and green when it was modest. Customers provided with this orb reduced their peak period energy use by 40%. Personally, I'm sold. I feel confident that nudges can and should be used to change environmental behaviour. So I invited Lis Costa back on the show to tell us more. Lis is Senior Director at the Behavioural Insights Team. She's written extensively about pro-environmental behaviour change. And to kick off today's show, I asked her if she thinks nudges can be used to solve climate change.
So the short answer is yes, it is definitely something we can do. So, the recent report from the Committee on Climate Change identified that over 60% of the actions that are required to achieve net zero also require behaviour change in some form. So this is certainly a behavioural challenge and a behavioural problem. So I think that there's really, a few different levels of behavioural intervention. And one is the direct actions that people can take to use less energy or consume in a more sustainable way. So those are things like installing heat pumps in their homes, purchasing an electric vehicle, eating less red meat. And I think in each of those, these are discrete individual behaviours, and a behavioural approach to encourage those changes has a lot of value and efficacy. But if we think about the world as it is now, it's not geared towards living a low carbon lifestyle. The context in which we're all operating is, a highly fossil fuel reliant, energy intensive world. And so while I think, you can nudge those types of behaviours, what we're really doing is, asking people to swim harder in a river where the current is flowing against them. And we can and should do that, but I don't think we'll get to net zero with only that approach.
Lis is right, of course. Nudges alone won't solve the problem. Climate change is arguably the toughest global challenge we will face. We'd be wrong to think that a few low-cost nudges can do the trick. They need to be balanced and backed up by policy change that forces behaviour. Some nudges, and of course some shoves. But it's not just nudges that behaviour science can use to impact change. And here's Lis highlighting that point.
Behavioural science has a lot more to offer than those discrete nudges, and I think that there is a lot of value in thinking about how we can create a choice environment that enables low carbon choices. and makes it as easy as possible to behave and make choices that are in line with net zero. We've done this across lots of policy areas. So if we think about pensions, for example, we know that there are a lot of behavioural barriers to saving for retirement, present bias being chief amongst them. And the switch in default in pensions in the UK to an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system led to more than 8 million people newly saving. And those pension defaults have been extremely sticky, even as savings rates have ratcheted up over the years. And, there's many aspects of environmental behaviours where we can take a similar behavioural approach to create that choice environment that makes low carbon behaviours the default, makes them the easy choice. So recently there was some great study done in Switzerland where they looked at 2 Swiss energy suppliers who changed their default offering to renewable energy only. And before this switch, only 3% of these energy suppliers' customers, which included households and businesses, only 3% of them were on purely renewable energy. And after this switch in the default, it rose to 80 to 90% of those customers. And, this was something that affected more than 200,000 households, 9,000 businesses. And it's also very sticky. So 4 years after this research was done, still 80% of those customers were still on the green tariffs. So you can see that's just one example, but I think there are many opportunities for behavioural interventions like that, which seek to really change the environment in which we're making these choices and make net zero, low carbon behaviours the norm and make them easy.
4 years ago, Cape Town was on the verge of running out of water. They were facing the city's worst drought on record. Despite the municipal government implementing a number of measures to try and get its 4.7 million residents to cut down on their water consumption, more than 60% of Cape Townians were still ignoring the call to action. The city then introduced restrictions on the amount of water each resident was allowed to use per day. They dialed down water pressure, hiked up tariffs, introduced fines, and installed water restriction devices at households who weren't complying. But despite all those shoves, consumption rates were still high. That finally changed in 2018. In January, the government launched a city-wide water-saving campaign underpinned by behavioural science and in particular social norms. One of the most impactful nudges was the publication of the names and addresses of the top water savers on the city's website. Those targeted with this message, and this was for a mix of demographics, they reduced their water use by 1.9%. The government rolled this out further with an online water map that acknowledged households that were achieving water-saving targets, and essentially, if a household reached that target, it was rewarded with a green symbol displayed on their property. In addition, smart water meters across 345 schools in Western Cape turned water conservation into a competition between schools. Schools were given a weekly report card on their water usage. Overall, these interventions had a huge effect. Depending on the metrics you look at, they led to between a 15 to 26% reduction in water usage. This is classic social norm stuff, highlighting that saving water is normal behaviour, that other people do it, and that you may be doing it better than others is a surefire way to encourage behaviour change. However, Cape Town's government may not have even tried that nudge if it wasn't for the original study that highlighted the impact of this effect. I asked Liz to talk through that original study on social norms and cutting energy use.
So the intervention in O-Power was to give people feedback on their energy bills. And that feedback took the form of how much energy that household was using compared to their neighbours, and particularly compared to their most efficient neighbours. And if their energy consumption was lower, they got a smiley face. And if it was much higher, they got a frown. And what we saw across multiple cultures and replications was that this led to an average of around 2% reduction in household energy use. It is also a very sticky intervention, so you see that energy use reduction persists over time. And even if you take the feedback away, you get a smaller effect size, but you do still get a reduction in overall energy use, even if you stop giving that feedback. And it's been a really nice experiment because it has also been translated to different cultures. In Japan, one of the energy companies there has run this experiment, but instead of smiley faces, they've used Japanese manga characters to convey this to households, which I think is a really nice cultural twist on the experiment.
What I think is great about this study is that it's low cost. In reality, this change probably doesn't cost energy companies anything. In fact, it probably saves them money. Many effective nudges don't cost anything at all. One study conducted in Mumbai found that water usage halved when restaurants began serving half glasses of water after they found that patrons were only taking a few sips and throwing the rest away. Similarly, a US study found food wastage was reduced in school canteens when plastic trays used to carry food were removed, forcing people to carry plates with their hands. These small changes can really have a big impact. But what would Lis choose? If she could pick, what would be the one change she would like to see in the world to nudge people towards better environmental decisions?
Look, one of the things that I'm most passionate about, bringing together the work I've done on financial behaviour and environmental behaviour, is the potential to shift people's pensions choices. So particularly, in the UK, there's around £3 trillion of assets under management in pension funds. That's absolutely enormous. It's about the equivalent of the annual GDP of the UK. And there's enormous power in how those funds are invested. And, at the moment, a small minority of those funds are in environmental social governance funds or ESG funds. And I think if we could prompt more people to either switch to an ESG fund or move to a world where we were encouraging pension providers to compete for customers on the basis of how good their ESG fund is, and potentially even making the ESG fund the default, I think we can really shift the axis of how funds are invested in the UK, how much capital and investment is going into things like renewable energy, electric vehicle technology. And I think change at that scale could really be a major driver of net zero, not just in the UK, but across the world, particularly in countries where, there are large-scale pension investments. So Australia, the US, a lot of Western economies. So I'd love to do more on that. If there's anyone listening who works for a pension fund or is interested in this, I'd love to talk to you.
Okay, that is all we have time for today. Now, to get in touch with Lis directly, you can reach out to her on Twitter. She's at Lis, that's LIS _Costa. I've left a link to her account in the show notes so you can find it there. And if you've been inspired by this episode and really want to make a change to your behaviour, then you could try or consider using Wren. Wren is a service to offset your climate emissions. Now, Wren's an online service. It helps you calculate your carbon footprint and then offset it for a monthly subscription. With many of us starting to travel again as sort of COVID restrictions ease, we're often doing it by flying, and it's really important, I think, that we understand the impact that has on the environment. So Wren not only lets you offset your daily and monthly emissions that you create just within your own home, but also emissions that you might generate if you took a big flight, for example. I've left a link to sign up in the show notes. As a real disclaimer, Wren hasn't sponsored this show. In fact, we don't have any sponsors on Nudge. I've just called them out because I think they're a decent organisation that some of you might want to use. All right, that is all for this week. Do join me again in 2 weeks for another episode of Nudge. Cheers.